Hello and welcome to week 17 of plant biology here at NICC. This is our last full week of sort of lecture type material, and we're going to be wrapping up our reading out of Concepts of Biology text, chapters 19 and 20. We're going to cover concepts of ecology, ecosystems, succession, biomes, and things like that. These are important concepts when we're talking about plant biology because oftentimes these sorts of things are what are driving plant communities and populations to be different in different areas. So chapter 19 is really the beginnings of the discussion on population and community ecology. Remember that populations of a species are a group of species that are interbreeding in a specific area. So a single species in an area breeding within itself. And then a community is all of the species in an area that are interacting together. So not just a species of plant, but all of the species of plants. It makes up the community. All of the species of plants and the animals and the bacteria and the fungi all working together, that is the community. Whereas a population is looking at a single specific species within that area and within that broader community. So you can think about that in very much the same way that you think about human populations. So you can have a population of a specific group within a broader community. It's very much the same thing when we're using animals and plants and other biological organisms as our frame of reference. But chapter 19 is really about population community ecology. In 19.1 in the book, we talk about population demographics and dynamics. So basically, how do scientists measure the population of a species? And then what can that data be used for? We can look at things like the distribution of the species in an area or across the globe. How well has a species been able to move across the globe and colonize different areas? We can look at demography. So how does a population change over time? How does a population change in response to a disturbance or something like that? And we can also look at survivorship. So do species grow in predictable ways? Are these species successful? Are they able to utilize their resources? 19.2 is really looking at how populations grow and regulate. So how do these, how does a population of organisms expand? And then what controls does the natural world put on that expansion so that we don't get these really steep growth curves that we do sometimes see in organisms. That steep sort of growth is what's known as exponential growth. So you start out very steady, but then as time progresses, those populations go up. Or we can have what's called a logistic growth, where you get the steady growth and then the steep growth, but we have this evening off sort of stage where the constraints of the environment really start to tamp down the growth of that population. They find sort of a maximum sort of carrying capacity for that species in that place. 19.3 is really talking about human growth, interesting, but not not totally relevant to the plant biology course. And then 19.4 picks back up with community ecology. So again, we're talking about communities. So a number of different species interacting with each other in an area. They talk about defense mechanisms, thorns, chemical defenses, things like that. These are all over the place in plants. Cacti have thorns. Any number of trees and shrubs have thorns on them to prevent herbivory. Chemical defenses, if anybody's ever walked through a patch of stinging nettles or poison ivy, you guys are familiar with chemical defenses against herbivory. Can be very unpleasant and, in fact, sometimes deadly in sufficient quantities, or it depends on the plant in question. But some plants definitely produce toxins that elevate up to this sort of deadly level to prevent other organisms from eating. Continuing with community ecology, we can talk about competition. So how are organisms competing with one another in this space for the limited resources in this place? The niche of an organism, N-I-C-H-E, some people say niche, I say niche. That's really the place that an organism lives in, along with its role in that place. It's not just the physical space, but the space and that organism's role within that place. Talk about different ways that organisms interact with one another. Symbiotic relationships. How well do organisms, or in what way do organisms interact? Are they parasites? Are they mutualistic? That's really when we're talking about these sort of inter and intra-specific competitions. That's what we're talking about. Also, this chapter talks about biodiversity. So we're really looking at species richness in an area. So how many species are in a place? Towards the equator, areas of high biodiversity. Lots of sunlight energy, lots of plant growth, lots and lots of resources for the growth and development of species. As we move out towards the poles, less sunlight, colder temperatures, generally less rainfall. The species diversity drops as we move towards the poles, generally speaking. Talk about foundation species, so the species that really work at building the base that everything else is working around. If we look at, let's say, a prairie in the Midwest, we have foundational species that are building up these prairie soils. These are plant species. We can also look at keystone species. So keystone species are species that have a sort of outsized role in their environments compared to their total biomass. We can also look at invasive species. So new species in an area that are exploiting open ecological niches, or that are able to push out existing species out of an area because they're more competitive. These invasive species are commonly occur in plant species as well. Wetlands, for example, have a common invasive species of reed canary grass. Phragmites, or a giant reed grass, is another plant species that often becomes invasive in wetland areas. Many cattails become invasive. There's a myriad of different choices of invasive species when we're looking at plants. Also, in 19.4, we're talking about community dynamics. So how do these plant communities change in response to disturbance? So if there's new bare rock, say a volcano spews out a bunch of bare rock, plants, seeds will find these places and try and colonize these areas. If we're starting with bare rock, that's called primary succession, where we're starting from nothing, and plant species move through these areas in very predictable sorts of ways, where you start out with, very low growing, hardy sorts of plants that build up the biomass in the area, and then, as the organic matter accumulates, more complex assemblages of plants start to come into an area. So we can also talk about secondary succession, where if we have, say, a forest and we clear cut the forest, then it's not like it's starting from zero. There's still a seed bank, there's still organic matter and things like that in these places. And how do those areas respond in response to that sort of disturbance as well? So community dynamics are also important when we're talking about plant biology. And that will wrap up in 19.4. And that really sort of covers the important parts of Chapter 19 for this class. Chapter 20 as well is read through Chapter 20, and Chapter 20 is really about ecosystems in the biosphere. So when we're talking about the biosphere, we're really talking about all of the life on Earth and the various ecosystems within the planet. Starts out talking about energy through ecosystems. It also talks about a basic question of what is an ecosystem. Really, an ecosystem is the organisms in a place, as well as, say, the chemical processes in this area that are influencing the development of the communities and things like that. Concepts such as equilibrium, or a balance. Many ecosystems really work at sort of finding this balance between growth and repression of growth and things like that. How resistant is this ecosystem? Is this ecosystem swing wildly in response to disturbances, or is it pretty resistant to change? And then resilience, if there is a major disturbance, how quickly can it cycle back up to sort of a mature level? Also talks about food chains and food webs in this chapter. Plants are vital to food webs and the cycling of energy through ecosystems. Photosynthetic organisms are almost always the base or the foundation of these food webs or food chains, and they really represent how energy is being gathered from the sun and moved into other organisms within these areas. So food web dynamics are really important when we're talking about plants, because everything else is eating these photosynthetic organisms, and that's really driving the energy for these systems. The chapter then moves on and talks about a number of what are called biogeochemical cycles, so life and earth chemicals basically, things like water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are big important molecules or compounds when we're talking about how life continues, and they really are all influence. These all really influence plant life and how plants develop in an area. All of this together really starts to talk about biomes and biome development. Biomes are big, broad areas of the landscape that are characterized by similar types of plant communities, basically. And they're really characterized by their temperature and their rainfall. So how hot or cold is an area and how much rain does it get? Those two criteria really are driving the types of plant communities that can develop in an area. And because those plant communities are the foundation to those energy food webs, those really drive what animals can live in a place too. So temperature and rainfall are what are driving the development of these biomes, and we can have different places across the globe can have similar temperature and rainfall regimes, and so we end up with areas that look very similarly. Say a desert looks kind of like a desert no matter where you are on the planet, but the plants might be different, but they'll generally have the same sort of form, how diverse these areas are. They'll have different species, but they'll look very similar, and they'll act in the same, very much the same way, regardless of where on the planet you are, because temperature and rainfall are driving the development of these biomes. When we're looking at aquatic biomes, as far as ocean biomes go, not super relevant for this class, although again, photosynthetic algae are what are driving oceanic biomes as far as the food webs go. But within freshwater biomes, plants definitely play a key role. When we're looking at lakes and ponds, maybe a little less, but we definitely have plant growth in those biomes and rivers and streams as well. But maybe the upland areas that feed these lower landscape features can really have a strong influence on it. And then wetland habitats really have a high amount of productivity, because these wetland areas have water, light, and lots of nutrients moving to them. So the plant populations and communities and wetlands are really critical and really play a strong role in developing these freshwater wetland biomes. Oftentimes, the type of biome can be classified by both water availability and by the plants that are present. So again, chapters 19 and 20 are really talking about the ecology and ecosystems that we are going to run into on the planet, and keeping in mind the plants and plant community development. You may or may not be able to tell, but this is the area that I'm most specifically interested in. So hope you've enjoyed this class. I will be in communication with you guys over the next week or so for finishing up any work that might need to be done. Have a great day.